welcome to the latest in this MPE 2022 interview series. We're here to ask some experts about the UK and European merchant payments regulatory scene. We all know that regulation and regulators have probably got the most influential role in creating and driving both the pace and direction of innovation in the merchant payment space. And so, therefore, it's really crucial that we understand as much about how we can get involved in that and influence it as possible. So, our experts that we've got here today are Ruth Wandhofer, who I know many of you will know, Nilixa Devlukia, and Paul Adams. So, all three of you, welcome, and I'm looking forward to hearing your views from your vast array of experience around the European merchant payments regulatory space. Now, let me just open with an overarching question. Given the complex nature of merchant payments regulation, how do merchant payment solutions providers and their merchant customers stay abreast of and prioritize all the areas of emerging payments legislation? And I'm first going to come out to Ruth. Ruth, give us your thoughts on that as a topic to begin with.
Thank you very much, Paul, and great to be here with you. As you pointed rightly out, I think the biggest issue is the complexity and also the amount of regulation that continues to be in the pipeline today. A lot of regulation will also focus more and more on data. So I think the whole spectrum of merchant and merchant solution providers will really need to keep abreast of the change. The easiest way to look at it is, of course, make sure that you are at least on different mailing lists around policy updates. The European Commission has various websites where they update the financial services community broadly around regulatory change. Sometimes you have also regulatory initiatives that don't look as if they may impact you. For example, if we think about the Data Act, or in a way data privacy, which we've seen several years ago. But these are also all laws that are not necessarily payment specific, but will definitely impact certain ways of operating and therefore also the solutions that have to be created. So the European Commission website is very important in terms of the European side of policy developments. Anything that happens there, they are the first ones that are drafting an idea, and then it goes into the Brussels sausage machine, as I call it. Of course, we have various trade bodies around Europe and in the UK that also pick up regulatory developments, whether that's banking industry trade bodies, e-money institution trade bodies, payment institutions, or just even business councils and business trade bodies that are looking at change in the market, which will look at change both in Europe and in the UK. Of course, from an UK perspective, the FCA website is very important, but I would also call out the Payment Systems Regulator website, because sometimes there are interesting reports or reflections around changes in digital payments. And I might just add briefly that even our recent work, which will be published hopefully by end of the month in April, around digital payments, has a very important component around looking at how the SME and merchant community is dealing with the change towards digital payments, and whether there are elements of policy, elements of standards, technological change, as well as protection and transparency that would benefit this community, and what we can do from a regulator perspective, from an industry perspective, to help that.
Thank you. And Nilixa, on that overarching question, what are your initial thoughts?
Thank you very much, Paul, and it's great to be here with you all today. I absolutely concur with everything that Ruth has just said. I think it's vital for merchants to know what is coming down the track. Um, Merchants were hugely impacted by, obviously, SCA, and I think that has been a harsh lesson learned for many merchants about not engaging and knowing enough about the regulatory agenda. Industry bodies, I think, are a prime source of information for merchants. There are obviously, in addition to what Ruth has articulated, industry conferences, and I think it's important that conference organisers also prioritise sessions at their own conferences that talk about regulation. If you look at the European regulatory agenda, in addition to everything that's coming down the track from the European Commission, there's also the initiative of central bank digital currency. And as and when a central bank digital currency is launched in Europe, merchants are going to want to accept it. If people want to pay with it, merchants need to be able to accept it. And it's just not knowing about the regulation that's important. For merchants, I think a primary concern is planning for technological change. And in order to do that, I think that merchants really need to consider how they engage with the regulatory agenda going forward.
I think that's a very, very good set of points, and I'll come back on a couple of those in a moment. But Paul, what are your thoughts on that overarching position?
Hi everyone, and thank you for having me today. So, to follow the theme, horizon scanning is key. Knowing your channels, knowing your inputs, who are the policymakers, building trusted relationships as far up the value chain as possible. We at Barclays are in a strong and unique position whereby we have relationships with both buyer and seller. And we have significant talent and resource available that is monitoring the external landscape, not only from a technological advancement perspective, but the policy and the legislation that will impact it. Our job is to inform our customers, to make that complex really simple, and to be guiding and to guide our clients on what the implications of that mean to our customers, the positive intent, the unintended consequences, and support them with actions and ultimately with solutions to help navigate the environment we navigate.
Thank you, Paul. And I think we've seen some common themes come through there, in that we want to see people staying informed. We want to see everyone in the ecosystem coming together and pulling together on this. Now, we know that legislators and regulators are regulating really based on historic or current detriments, and therefore there seems to be urgency in terms of the things that they would wish to shape and change. And therefore we find that perhaps some of the timelines that they would like to see as regulators and legislators may not actually align very well with what the complex merchant payments ecosystem looks like, with all of its different layers, whether it's card schemes or acquirers or payment processors or gateways and merchants. And gathering everyone that's affected in that together can often present quite a challenge. So what would you say are the best approaches if an organization wants to shape that legislation that's perhaps currently sitting on the horizon, but is going to affect the industry in quite a short time frame? Nilixa, have you any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think it's important, Paul, that merchants think about how they can actually interact with legislators and regulators. They can, of course, do that through their industry bodies. I mean, that would be the main, I think, forum for smaller merchants who are not necessarily going to have the manpower to engage directly. Larger merchants, of course, can and will be engaging with regulators, industry bodies, even Parliament, in order to shape that regulatory agenda. But I also think it's important just to highlight that, in my view, the regulatory bodies have come to a better understanding of the impact on the merchant ecosystem of not thinking about that stakeholder group. And I go back, I mentioned it before, but SCA is the prime example of that, in that there was a piece of legislation that was intended to be implemented on the same day across Europe, and actually it only thought about the interaction for regulated entities, but that impact of that piece of legislation went far beyond that. And I think that the work that the regulators in the UK, the FCA of course, and the others did in order to then shape that ecosystem to bring the merchants into the discussion will be lessons learned across the industry.
I think those are really great points. And as someone who's been involved in the SCA agenda since August 2016, I can really concur with what you're saying. And I think if there is one big lesson to learn, it is that reaching out to beyond the a regulated entity to the wider ecosystem is crucial. Now, Paul, you've already said that you Barclays as an organisation is in an incredible position to act as a facilitator and link together all of those stakeholder groups. How do you think we can best do that in practice to make sure that you as an organization aren't just looking at it as a regulated entity, but you're weaving in the other heavily influenced organizations and organizations that can actually push back in a proactive and practical way to perhaps help give more constructive shape to the legislation, particularly as it goes through those early consultation phases like we saw in 2016, 2017, 2018 with SCA?
Great question, Paul. I think the principal thing here is about engagement. It's engaging a wide set of stakeholders and informing and being a sponge, listening. What is the impact, the consequence, both good, bad, intended, unintended, and how do we engage across both our own internal network? We've got a plethora of information and knowledge and expertise in policy and solutions, in client, in geographies. Even within Barclays, we're challenging ourselves around obtaining a house view that's best for both end users, but also participants in that multifaceted, multi-layered, complex ecosystem. So, look, I think that's within the Barclays world. Outside of that, we're having to engage with many more participants who are reliant both upon our services and our rails, but we're also reliant on them in terms of presenting these solutions, changing their technology, changing their their customer behavior, joint customer behavior. So there's a lot of stakeholder groups here, as we've mentioned before. There's many channels. Firstly, are merchants utilizing the expertise from their payment solutions provider? Is that provider giving them the voice in the market? And then there's the trade associations or directly with government and policymakers themselves. So it is complex, it's multifaceted, but we've got lots of assets at our disposal to try and drive ultimately the common objectives of regulators. That it's about making things better for end users, and we're all in that together.
Yes, you're absolutely right there. We are all actually embarking on the same journey with the same objectives, and pulling together on this is absolutely key. Now, Ruth, just to reflect on a point that Nilixa made, which I think was very valid, the regulatory authorities, I think, are showing an increased level of engagement with all stakeholder groups. And both in reflecting on the question I'd asked about how we can shape that legislation, perhaps give some thoughts on that in terms of where is the change of heart, perhaps, or change of positioning of the regulator, and how's that looking going forward? But also maybe any reflections that you've got on how we might build better relationships with the influencers of legislation and regulation.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I mean, certainly with all the change continuing to happen in the payment space, we have to be very mindful that there's so many new technological and regulatory driven alternatives coming up for merchants that it's even more important for merchants to start engaging for their own benefit, because they will see more choice going forward. The regulators are very keen to deliver more choice. If I just reflect upon the payment systems regulator in the UK, they want to make sure that merchants have more choice, particularly also the smaller merchants that today might be restricted to a limited number of options. And of course, we're all on the digitization journey, so we need to make sure that we reduce the use of cash because it is a very costly affair, and not everybody can use some of the instruments that are on offer in the market today. So I think there's a very good time to start engaging a lot more proactively from the merchant side. But equally, as Nilixa pointed out, SCA was a great example where the regulators were quite clearly made aware that this is going to be an issue for many more parties than maybe what the regulators and policymakers initially expected. So there are ways of engaging more directly. There's a payment systems expert group at European level, which also has representation from technological providers and the merchant community. In the UK, if I just think about the PSR panel itself, which is an independent panel of experts, we have representation from the small business community, from the business community, from technological providers. And I'm trying to expand this group to have a really good stakeholder group that can opine on payments in the broadest ecosystem sense. Because as you listed, there's so many different players that have different roles. And I'm also thinking, building upon Nilixa's point around conferences and keeping people up to date with regulatory change, we might, certainly in the UK, which is a sort of smaller market that we can oversee well, find a way to set up a type of forum where we bring all the participants in the ecosystem together. That could be something, Paul, for you to think about as well, because I think these would be opportunities to have dedicated roundtables around specific changes that are happening, and then build upon what Paul Adams was saying. The policies that you had sort of the house use, you're helping to develop across both the issuing, acquiring, the merchant, the buyer, the seller. You have all the different views on the table, and that would be something we could even practically think about taking forward as an interesting best practice example, which could replicate in other European countries and certainly also be shown to the European Commission from that perspective. Yeah.
Great. Well, I really appreciate all those views, and I certainly concur with every single one of them. It's certainly been a mission of mine to bring together the key stakeholders across the payments industry for the last 20 years, and in the opportunity to discuss this with you today, to push these thoughts out into the wider merchant payments community, and also reflect on the fact that we will all be coming together at Merchant Payments Ecosystem in Berlin in a very short time. Then we can build on those conversations and extend our knowledge and extend our engagement. So thank you all very much for your contributions, and I look forward to continuing this discussion as we go through the next few months. So thank you. Really appreciate it.